Hello, my name is R.BARBER. I've written a book called Prophets of the Bible. It's been a long time coming. During this COVID lockdown between February and August, I was able to spend several hours every day researching and writing, and that's on top of probably 50 years of being a Christian and thinking about the Bible and thinking about the themes that this book is going to cover. And the book is now available, and it's available on Amazon. It's available in some bookshop outlets, particularly in Southend where I live, and from me, of course. So what I'd like to do for this video is talk you through the book. It's about the prophets of the Bible and their prophecies. It's taken into account the times they lived in, the legacy that they left, and the lessons that we might learn from them. It's aimed at serious Bible students of whatever church or non-church affiliation, and it is trying to concentrate on what we would call the fancy word exegesis. Of course, when it comes to prophets and prophecies, people do have views, and I tried to focus on expanding what the Bible has to say, although I do offer views and admit where I see things differently to other people, but that's okay because I'm not here to inflict my opinion on others. So you've seen the front cover. If you look at the back cover, there are a lot of pretty pictures. The first thing to say, it's not a children's book. You will probably see from the images on the front and the back, they're well-known scenes through the Bible, and which you probably can identify. And all these are covered within the book, but a lot more. And what we try to do is cover all the prophets and those who acted prophetically during in the record of the Bible. I should have to also add, as a Christian, I'm beholden to both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And yet, when you come to studying the prophets, most of them are found in the Old Testament. It's not that I'm trying to give a particular bias to one testament over the other. It just happens you get a lot more prophets and prophecies in the Old than you do in the New. And yet we do cover the New. And actually there is a lot of prophecy that is still to be fulfilled, in my view. So what I'm going to do now is take you from the beginning of the book. I've got, for want of a better word, the stuff at the beginning, the stuff at the start, because every book contains blurb about the book, the author, what affected the author, and it's almost like the author tries to get it off his chest before he goes on to the meat of the book, and I've done the same. Probably I'll put it here under three headings. One is about me, the author, about the influences on me, about the version of the Bible that I use, which I'm unapologetic. I use the King James Version, although I do refer to other versions as well. And then I go on to the acknowledgements. So there are a lot of people that have played a part in producing this book, and I like to acknowledge them and give credit where credit is due. There have been lots of resources that I've used and drawn upon, and I mentioned some of these. And then I come to a preface. A preface, I'm told, is you, the author, trying to tell people why it's a good idea for you to read their book. And it's my shot, if you like, of trying to convince readers why my book is worth reading and the significance of it and the type of people I imagine will be reading it. I should add that at the beginning, I talk in the first person. That is me talking to you. But after that, when I go into the chapters, which we'll get to, it turns to the third person, because I don't want it to be about me. And I don't even want it to be about the prophets. I want it to be about the God of the prophets. And if nothing else, I want you to recognize that God, Yahweh, or Jehovah, as is referred to in the Old Testament, is the God that is worthy of all worship and of our complete allegiance. So let's go on to the chapters. So the first chapter naturally will be an introduction. So I'm introducing my subject, which is the prophets of the Bible. I try to come up with some working definition of prophets. I realise that actually there doesn't appear to be a complete definitive definition, and so I tend to use the word prophet rather loosely. There are people that somehow knew the mind and heart of God and tried to convey it to the people they were speaking to, and often linked with that was predictions of what would happen in the future. That is, if you like, a loose definition. But in addition, there are lots of people in the Bible that we wouldn't regard as prophets, and yet they said, acted, did things that we could regard as prophetic. There are many common factors about prophets. Often prophets weren't listened to. Often they had a hard time. It's not a job that if you knew what hard time they had, you'd want to apply for. Although I'm sad to say that there are lots of people that wanted the glory without actually going through the bit about honouring the Lord, and we will come to that during the course of the book. So basically, chapter 1 is me setting out the store. So when I come to chapter 2, it's looking at the prophets in context. I can't stress how important it is when you're reading the Bible, studying the Bible, that you need to read it in context. It's no point in just picking out the bits that you like, or even with the prophets talking about the easy bits about their lives and some of the things they said that particularly stand out. You really need to look at the whole of it, and not just the whole of what's said about the prophet and their prophecy, but the times they lived in, what was going on at the time, an understanding perhaps of the geography and the politics and the history of the region, the archaeology that might back up things. There are a number of things that we would consider when we're considering the context of the Bible. What I've done also during that in that chapter is to introduce a number of charts and if you like, maps and tables, which I refer to later in the book, which will help you to understand the prophets in context. Chapter 3 I've called Prophets, Priests and Kings. The reason why I've done that is that if you look at the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, it seems to me that there were three categories of persons that featured, and they weren't the only ones, but prophets, priests and kings were that. So prophets operated alongside priests and kings, and all of them had a role to play, and quite different roles. There were occasions when the roles could be combined, and so I really wanted to consider prophets alongside these other offices, if you like. I also wanted to consider the Bible as a whole, particularly considering the two major events in the Old Testament. I would say they were the Exodus, the coming out of the children of Israel from Egypt into the Promised Land, and the exile when they were effectively thrown out of the Promised Land and had to go into captivity. Some, of course, return later, and all that we will cover during this book. And while we're on the subject of prophets, priests and kings, never to lose sight of the fact that the the one that combined all the offices was the Lord Jesus Christ. He was a prophet, priest and king, and a lot more than that. So I consider that too in this chapter. So I start off in chapter 4 from the beginning. And where do you go for the beginning? You go to the book of Genesis, which means origins. And you get the origin of so much that matters in the book of Genesis. It's the origin of creation, it's the origin of man, it's the origin of sin, it's the origin of marriage, it's the origin of government. And then, of course, really important is the origin of Israel, God's chosen people. And much of the Bible that follows is about their history, their story. And I consider that. Now, you might say, what's Genesis got to do with prophets? And I would argue that even though most of the characters in Genesis we wouldn't think in terms of being prophets, many of them acted prophetically. And I will make a case going, if you like, from Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and others, of being at least acting prophetically. And actually both Enoch and Abraham are actually referred in the Bible as prophets. So we then go on to what comes after the Genesis. We go into the other books of Moses, as they're often called. Those 5 books of Moses in the Old Testament is called the Pentateuch. So we start off with Genesis, and then we go on to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And most of the story in those books revolves round the journey of the children of Israel to them being on the verge of the promised land. And in between, they had to spend 40 years wandering, if that's the right word, in the wilderness. But significantly, during that time, they were given the law, the covenant. The covenant was really important as far as the Old Testament and all Testaments are concerned. We, as those of us who are Christians, will talk about the New Covenant, and that's true. We're part of that. But the Old Covenant is also very important and significant. And it's because God wanted a covenant relationship with his chosen people that things happen the way they did. Now, a lot of things happen because they broke the covenant. That's the chosen people, and God had to judge, but he always acted in mercy too. And a lot of the story of the prophets is about that. Of course, the figure that stands out during that is Moses. And Moses was an incredible person in terms of being called by God and having that intimate relationship where God spoke to him, and there was a lot about his acting, his character, his words that is all important. And also, while we're at it, the whole issue of the temple worship, the tabernacle as it was then, and the system of sacrifices, the system of feasts, is also very important to our story. And I try to cover that too within that chapter. So we go on to chapter 5. So we leave the Pentateuch with the children of Israel about to enter the promised land. They enter the promised land under Moses' successor Joshua, and then they have to live there for 200 years. And they were governed effectively by what we call as judges. They weren't actually judges in the way we understand judges. Somebody said they were effectively troubleshooters that sorted people out while when things weren't going particularly well. And some of these judges were quite notable characters. I reflect, for example, on Japheth, Gideon, and Samson. Has been, and there were a number of other judges too. The last judge is Samuel. Samuel was a significant figure because he breached that gap between the time of the judges and the time of the kings. It wasn't God's purpose, his will for the children of Israel to have a king, but they wanted a king so they can be like the other nations, and God gave them the king. They gave them Saul, and later they gave them David, and then the other kings followed, which we will come to later. So basically, in this chapter, we look at this period between entering Canaan's land, the promised land that God promised to Abraham, and to the time that they appointed a king through Samuel. And then we come to, then I thought what we'll do is, I'm sorry I'm referring to a note here because I might miss something out. In fact, I have made a mistake, which is okay, because that was what I was talking about was chapter 8, which is the bit about Joshua through to Samuel, and there was 2 chapters in between. So I got carried away, but I think we'll work it out anyway. So the chapter I really wanted to talk about, false prophets. The Bible is full of false prophets, sad to say, and the Bible makes it very clear what makes a false prophet and what makes a true prophet. And there are many false prophets in the Bible, just as there are false prophets today. And the Bible makes it very clear what constitutes a true prophet and a false prophet. And we look at the examples in the Bible, right across the Bible, of false prophets. But in particular, we focus on Balaam. One of the reasons we focus on Balaam is that there's a lot written about him. And another reason he's referred to quite a bit in the New Testament as an example not to follow. So during that chapter, I look into the false prophets of the Bible. And then before I really get going in when prophets really come thick and thin, if you like, I wanted to take time out to talk about prophetesses. Most of the prophets of the Bible are men. That's probably understandable, given the patriarchal society that operated in those days. And yet, the women prophets, the prophetesses, were no less important and significant. 3, Deborah, Miriam, and Huldah, are referred to as prophetesses. If you were to look at the Jewish book, the Talmud, they have an opinion about who the lady prophets were, and they come up with 4 more. Sarah, Hannah, and Abigail was one more, and there's one more else. So I talk about those as well. And I also talk about ladies that really had a prophetic ministry. Do you know the first lady prophet in the New Testament wasn't John the Baptist? It was actually Anna, a prophetess. And you could argue that Isaiah's wife is a prophetess because she is referred to as the prophetess. We don't know what her name is, but she is the prophetess. So I consider that. And also sad to say that there were also lady false prophets as well as truth prophets. And I cover that in that particular chapter. So I'm now back on track. So I'm going now to King David. This book isn't about the kings, but David is particularly significant because of the covenant God made with David. In fact, he promised that there'll always be somebody on the throne of David. And effectively, when the Bible ends, and as far as the Jewish people were concerned, the Bible ends in Chronicles, it is still looking forward to that Davidic line from which the Messiah, Jesus, as we Christians would see it, came from the line of David. And indeed, even beyond that, when we see the coming again of Jesus, he is part of that line of David, and that is mentioned a number of times in the Bible. So I thought it was important to talk about David. A lot is written about him in the Bible. But also he qualifies, in a sense, with the prophet, as being a prophet. I mean, have you considered the Psalms, half of which are written by David? And a good number of those are what we call messianic Psalms. My God, why hast thou forsaken me in Psalm 22. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Psalm 110. They were considered Psalms of David. So I don't apologise for talking about David, because he sort of qualifies, even if he's not a prophet, he spoke and acted prophetically. But he did have two prophets around him, and they weren't yes men. And that's the brilliant thing about these people. They spoke truth to power, as we like to talk about it these days. And they were Nathan and Gad. And David has a lot to be thankful for Nathan and Gad. And I consider those two in this particular chapter. So moving on. So when you think of prophets, who are the quintessential prophets of the Bible? And I guess some of you will come up right away and say Elijah, and then maybe add Elisha. Elisha took the mantle from Elijah after Elijah had been taken up in the chariot of fire. You would know the story well, perhaps. And what I do in this chapter is consider those two prophets. They were remarkable. They were remarkable in many ways. They were remarkable because they performed many miracles. The story of Elijah and the contest with the prophets of Baal is an incredible story. His fleeing from Jezebel, his depression, and his being spoken to by God on the holy mountain, not in the earthquake, wind and fire, but a still small voice, told to anoint Jehu and the king of Syria. Remarkable. And Elisha, of course. So we talk about Elijah and Elijah, and of course Elisha. Elisha is significant too, because he asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, and he got it. And we refer to Elisha, it was referred to as him. He knew what the king spoke in his bedroom. And if you think about it today, with all the crooked politicians around and leaders, wouldn't it be lovely if there were prophets that knew exactly what was going on, not what their spin doctors say is happening. But hey ho, where it's all in God's hands. But these Elijah and Elisha were remarkable men of God that prophesied. Before I go on to the majors and the minors, I call them, or the writing prophets as they're sometimes referred to, I devote the next chapter to what I call the unnamed, unknown and less known prophets. And if you were to do take an online Bible and do a search on maybe the word proph, you would actually find, and you may be surprised, how many prophets will come up that you may not have even thought about as being prophets. There were lots of them. And a number, we don't even know their names. And that itself is significant, because in a way the prophets were messengers of God. It wasn't about them, it was about the Lord. And all they were doing was faithfully conveying the word of the Lord to the people that needed to hear the word of the Lord. They were like us in terms of their frailties and foibles, and yet they spoke faithfully what God wanted. And what I do in this chapter is a complete sweep of the Bible, and not the New Testament, I mean the Old Testament. And anybody that I consider as being a prophet, or that is because they're called a prophet, or a seer, or a watchman, which were both names given to prophets, I consider. Not only that, I consider those who acted prophetically. Maybe a bit controversial, you may think, but have you ever thought about Nebuchadnezzar, after he had been humbled by God and he was able to proclaim the wonders of the Lord to this pagan culture that, and no doubt had a huge effect on the dealings of God and with his people, or even Cyrus, the one that was predicted by Isaiah 200 years before he came and did exactly what God had said of him. I would argue that these were acted prophetically, or somebody like Job. I mean, Job said something that people hadn't thought about that much. I know my Redeemer liveth, and he will stand on that last day. So what I'm saying is that I use this chapter, I use license, it is true, to cover the prophets that are not covered elsewhere, usually less known, sometimes not named, or those that in one way or another acted prophetically. Then I come, if you like, to the two biggies, the big chapters of the book. Big because they say a lot. There's a lot about them. So you come to the next chapter, which is the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Interestingly, as far as the Hebrew Bible is concerned, Daniel was not even included amongst the prophets. He's included in what they call the writings, but some of the most amazing prophecies in the Bible, and the one that's caused so much controversy amongst pundits, is Daniel. So Daniel, even though his job was not as a prophet, he was effectively a high-ranking civil servant, and he did prophecies, if you like, in his spare time. But he was an amazing prophet, as were Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and none of them you would want to envy their job. That's why I always say to people, I don't want to be a prophet, because I knew what the cost is. If God calls me to be one, that's okay. I have to obey what God says. But I think I had Isaiah ended. The tradition was, if you go to Josephus, he was sawn in two by the wicked king Manasseh. You think of poor Jeremiah, who was he had very few friends. He was persecuted and punished, and he wasn't allowed to marry because it was part of what God wanted. And then you got Ezekiel. Ezekiel had to spend many days laying on his side, eating on starvation rations. And when his wife died, he wasn't allowed to mourn her death. None of these, their life was easy, and yet they acted faithfully. And what they prophesied was huge. And I can't do justice to that in the book. It will require several books. But what I've done, I've had a go at trying to pick the significant things that these prophets said. And then we move on to the next chapter, which is the minor prophets. They weren't minor in the sense that they were less important or less significant. They're regarded as minor, I suppose, because they wrote less than the major prophets. And you start off with Hosea and the prophets before the exile. Even Hosea and Amos, they were operating while the northern kingdom, the kingdom were divided by then. The northern kingdom, Israel, was still intact before they had been taken off by the Assyrians. They were warned about it by these two. A lot of what they were interested in were what we would call social justice issues. I make this point because people should not cherry pick when it comes to prophets. The prophets were concerned about the poor. They were concerned about people being oppressed. They were concerned about justice being done. But they was also concerned about the true worship of Yahweh. They were concerned that people did not worship idols. They were concerned about the people keeping the covenant they had with Yahweh, and if they didn't, there will be consequences, which we know happen. And yet, also what these people prophesied was what we would call apocalyptic. That is to say, about end times, where there would be all sorts of things happening, and we can't dismiss that. People try to. I have to say, this is where I put my colours to the mask. I see a lot within both the major prophets and the minor prophets and elsewhere talking about times yet to happen, and I cover that. I also make it important that Israel has not been replaced by the church. The church and the Israel are both part of God's heart and mind. Israel is Israel, and the church may conclude those who are of Israel, but there is a significant place for Israel. I'm not here to pontificate on what's happening in the Middle East at this time, the rights and wrongs of what Israel, the nation, does today. But I am going to say that God has a purpose for Israel, and there will be a time, Paul says it very clearly, when all Israel will be saved. And we look forward to that time. We look forward to that time when Zechariah remarks they will look upon him being the Messiah, the returning Messiah. They will look upon him and they will weep. They will realise who their Messiah truly is. But I go into that and I look at the apocalyptic. But I try to keep the balance. I want to focus on the social justice, the stuff that, if you like, folk on the left politically might want to be interested in, and the other stuff, the pure worship of God, and the stuff about things yet to happen. And then I go on to prophets of the New Testament. Now I have to confess I struggle a little bit there because there ain't many mentioned. Even so, the gift of prophecy is an important gift. It's one of the gifts of the Spirit. When on the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit came upon the church, it was in fulfillment to the prophecy of one of our minor prophets, Joel, that the young men will see visions and your old men will dream dreams. The gift of prophecy was a gift given to the church, as was the office of prophet. So perhaps we'd make that distinction. People from some branch of the church, of some which I come from, may be fairly comfortable with pastors, teachers and evangelists, but there was also apostles and prophets. And I'm not going to pontificate on the place of these today. That is not my job. I'm here just to expand. But going back to the prophets of the New Testament, not much is said about individuals. I do trawl through the book of Acts, and I see mention of prophets. That there was this chap called Agabus, and twice he prophesied something quite significant. But you are struggling to find examples of prophets in the New Testament, and yet we know the gift of prophecy was an important gift. And who is to say it still is not an important gift? That's something perhaps to ponder. What I do focus on in the prophets of the New Testament is the two people that we do know a lot about. One is John the Baptist, who clearly is a prophet, is named as a prophet. Jesus refers to him as the greatest of all the prophets. Again, one that had a pretty sticky ending. He spoke truth to power and he lost his head as a result of it. And yet he was an amazing prophet of God, who I discuss in this book, as do I the Apostle John. I'm happy to accept that the one who wrote the book of Revelation was that beloved disciple John. Others may dispute it, and maybe it's not an incredible important thing, but the book of Revelation is an important book of the Bible. There is the book that where a promise is attached to those who read it. A warning is attached for those that want to dismiss the words that it says. And there is much, I would argue, in the book of Revelation that is yet to be fulfilled. I would say anything from after chapter 3 onto chapter 22 is yet to be fulfilled. And we can see the signs. And again, I'm not here to speculate on things happening in the world and how that links with prophesying with Revelation, other than say that the signs are there. And I think the signs will become increasingly apparent. I feel a bit like Daniel, who was told these amazing stuff, and some of the stuff that Revelation picks up on. He said, you don't know this, Daniel, but just write it down because it will become clear at a later point. And even now, perhaps some of these things have yet to become fully clear. So I have a go at prophets of the New Testament. I also sort of reflect on the fact that I think there has always been a prophetic voice within the church, even now. I don't want to, again, get tied up who are the prophets and not. I suspect there are many I would see as being false prophets. I see prosperity teaching as a part of false prophecy. but I'm not here, and part of my admission, I don't come from a church background that is very much into modern day prophets. I disagree with some of my friends from that background that said prophets have ceased. I don't believe that is true. The Bible doesn't say it is true. But I have a go at New Testament prophets. And then chapter 15 is an opportunity to let rip. I realise, having gone through the Bible, and the Bible finishes, or the New Testament part of it, so that's the Bible finishes toward the end of the first century. So I've gone through the prophets of the Bible, hopefully and faithfully as best I can, realising there probably is a lot more that could be said. But I then realised that there's a lot about what they prophesied that I haven't covered, I haven't done justice to. It's also areas that cause controversy. If you were to go onto YouTube and type in Daniel 70 weeks, for example, you would find several different views about that. You try it. I did, because that was part of my research. So what I decided to do was to go through to select 20, I don't want to use the word controversial, but prophecies that actually are challenging in terms of understanding what they come to. I identified 20. Some of them are in Revelation, but I try to keep out of Revelation if I can, because a lot of what Revelation is saying has already been said earlier in other prophets anyway. And so I identified 20. I try to play it down the middle. I recognise that I come from, I admit my eschatology, if you can bear with that word, is premillennial. I'm not convinced about the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, so I'm being honest here. I don't know. And I am trying my best. I also believe a literal interpretation of the Bible is by and large the one we should take. I also believe Israel, as I said earlier, has not been replaced, and there is a special place for Israel. So I lay my cards on the table, and I lay that based upon my study of the Bible. I recognise that some who will listen to who read my book may not hold those views, and that's okay, because I'm getting you to read the Bible, and that's what really matters. So I have a go at digging deeper into the prophecy. So I come to what was meant to be my last chapter, and I'll switch now to the first person, because I'm given a view. Again, I'm trying to be circumspect in not being too outlandish, and recognising people see things differently, but recognising what can we learn from the prophets. I would argue there is a lot that we can learn from the prophets, and I have a stab of what it is, my own experience, even going back to the one person that prophesied into my life. I use that as an example about people, even in the Plymouth Brethren, which is my own background, who tended to be those that weren't into prophets, who actually did prophesy and had a prophetic ministry. I talk about all sorts of stuff in that chapter. It's actually learning from the prophets. It's not so much what it is about things I derive from it. It's really a challenge to use the reader to think, you've gone through the Bible now, you consider the prophets, what lessons are there to be drawn? So, if you like, I'm trying to learn there. I actually end with a couple of prayers. One is a prayer of praise and thanksgiving, and the other is a prayer of supplication and intercession, because if nothing else, reading about the prophets of the Bible, reading the Bible anyway, should cause us to praise and thank God. It also should cause us to intercede and make supplications unto the Almighty, and I encourage that, and that's how I end the book. But then I realised going through the book, there were a lot of stuff, a lot of themes that really needed to be covered, that deserve to be covered. For example, the church, quite a controversial issue. What is the church? Because I refer to it sometimes. Is it a building? Is it an organisation? What is the church? What is Israel? Is it a country? Is it or is it something deeper than that? And issues like what is the gospel? Really, that is the most important thing. And a number of what I call subjects. I even look at the issue of apologetics. My book isn't a book about apologetics. Apologetics is actually justifying why the Bible is to be believed. Now, one could argue, and I would argue this, you read different people about the number of prophecies in the Bible. I'm not going to analyse that to the nth day. Let's say one person put it down to something like 2,000, and he came to a view that 1,500 of those prophecies have been fulfilled, and some of those fulfilments are absolutely remarkable. I mean, I mentioned earlier about Cyrus. Now, you could dismiss that was written after the event, which of course some people will try to do, but Isaiah predicted Cyrus will come 200 years before he came. He wasn't even thought of then. Even the Persian Empire, which he headed, was not even known. There was things about the destruction of Tyre, of Nineveh, of parts of Edom, remarkable in their fulfilment. Plenty of others, and I'll say to my Jewish friends, and I say this very humbly, and you think about Isaiah chapter 53, you have a problem, right, with that, because if the Messiah hasn't yet come, what is Isaiah 53 all about? And you read through that, and you read the detail, remarkable detail, some of it verified by other extra to the Bible, New Testament sources, fulfilled in Jesus. Now I look at the issue of apology. I don't want to ramble on, but basically chapter 17 is taking 10 topics, and there could be others, and just considering them briefly for you to do. And then finally, I end the book with stuff at the end. Sorry to use the vernacular, if you like. Most books I read come up with appendices and stuff that they want to add on, so I thought why I could do the same one. I have a go at writing poetry. I write a poem about the prophets. I do a bit about questions, so if you were doing Bible studies in a group, maybe this book could be used in that context. Questions you might want to consider. I don't give the answers. Maybe there isn't a definitive answer, but I'm asking questions that you might like to ask about the prophets of the Bible. And I'll just say else, because it's really significant right now. What would the prophets made about COVID-19? I mean, Habakkuk, for example, looked upon the looming threat of Babylon, and he was asking, Lord, what's going on here? I can't figure it out. He asked questions. It was a heart plea. Now, Habakkuk, unlike me, got some sort of answer. Maybe I have had some sort of answer, but I don't want to go beyond. So I'm asking the question, all the things going on at the moment with this lockdown, and is it a hoax or is it the real thing, and what is the right answer? It's my prayer to God. I ask that prayer. So it's my, if you like, my trying to put myself in the shoes of one particular prophet, Habakkuk. So that's how I end the book. It's not complete. I can think of more things I'd like to add, but that may be for another time. But that's how I finish the book. So I just want to finish on just two notes. One is how to get hold of the book. I hope that what I said would have at least whetted your appetite to get it. So I refer to my website, rbpublications.com. You can actually read it free online. It's an electronic version. I'm not fussy about making profit from it. I certainly won't make money from it. But if you want to read about the prophets of the Bible without having to buy anything, you can go online and read it. It's a PDF file, so you just have to, if you can cope with PDFs, I can. It's not. I'm used to it a bit now, so you can read it that way. I leave my email on this slide. I'm happy to enter in correspondence with people. You can, if you live in my area, which is Southend-on-Sea, in England, get it from the South End Christian Bookshop, or from me if you want to knock on my door or say come around. It's there. And as is the want these days, you can get it through Amazon. My relationship actually is not with Amazon, it's with Ingram, but that's just by the way. The way these guys work, and I'm learning so much, is that they sell each other's books. But if you go online, you can buy it on Amazon, and they're often deals as well, so you can get it at a cut down price. So if you really want to get hold of the book, that may be the easy way of doing it. So I end on a final note. It's a final thought. The book is not about me. It's not even about the prophets. It's about the Lord, and it's getting people to read the Bible. I want people to read the Bible. They don't have to agree with what I have to say, but if the book helps them to unravel what the Bible has to say, then I've done my job. And my final thought is with William Tyndale. William Tyndale, as some will know, was one of the people that earlier translated the Bible from the original tongue, Hebrew, Greek, into the English language. And his idea was that the most common person, the most ordinary person, should be able to read the Bible. Because if you read the Bible, you understand about God, about his purposes in the world. You make sense of so much. It's everything. And Tyndale gave his life. Well, he did give his life because he was burnt at the stake for doing that, because it wasn't really looked upon favourably by the powers that be. So that's how I end the book. So thank you very much for listening and watching this video, and all I can say, may God bless you, and also encourage you to study the prophets or to study the Bible. Thank you very much.